My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center here at Georgetown, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this third and final evening with Hans Joas around the topic of universal human rights. For those of you who have not been here the last couple of evenings for whatever reason, we're in the midst of an extended conversation about the origins of human rights, not out of abstract philosophical and religious propositions, but out of historical experience. On Tuesday, we looked at the experience of violence, and yesterday we looked at the gradual sacralization of the human person. Today, the topic is human rights and universal values, and the possibility of a productive dialogue about those values across cultural and religious divides. I'm going to keep my introduction even shorter tonight. Again, you can read about Professor Joas in the program. Just to note that he shares his time between the University of Chicago and the University of Erfurt, where he heads the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies. He has a long string of distinguished publications and is really among our most creative thinkers at the intersection of religion, society, values, and human rights. So with that, let me ask you to welcome Hans Joas once again.
Thank you once again. It's getting a kind of tradition now, so tomorrow I will probably show up again at 7 o'clock and be surprised if nobody's here. This lecture, this third lecture, is an attempt to demonstrate that a certain concept I'm going to propose, namely the concept of value generalization, is of considerable importance for moral philosophy in general and for the study of human rights in particular. This concept, the importance of this concept that has been developed in one of the most ambitious sociological theories of social change, lies in its relevance for what one could call the logic of a communication about values. My claim is that the communication about values is different from a purely rational argumentative discourse in a strict sense, but also far from a mere clash of values or identities or civilizations, and far from any form of irrationalist decisionism, as if ultimate values could only be chosen in an existential way without any reasoning and intersubjective plausibility. I will proceed in 4 steps. After a reflection on the limitations of rational discourse, that's the first step, and a typology of the alternatives to the idea of an inevitable clash of values and identities, second step, I will present this concept of value generalization in some detail, that's the third step, and then illustrate it a little bit by demonstrating that the process that led to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 can indeed be seen as a process of such a process of value generalization. So whereas the 2 first lectures were mostly historical, sociological, historical, so to speak, this lecture has a philosophical side to it. The first 3 steps, of course, are rather philosophical. The 4th will then return to these historical matters. First, why do we need a specific theory of the communication about values? Why can't we be satisfied with the theory of the rational discourse, given the elaboration of an extremely sophisticated version of such a theory in the works of the German philosophers Jürgen Habermas and Karl Otto Apel. Inspired, as you probably all know, by the path-breaking work of Charles Peirce, the founder of American pragmatism, but also taking up suggestions from analytical philosophers and linguists, and above all from Stephen Toulmin's 1958 book, The Uses of Argument, these 2 thinkers, Habermas and Apel, have elaborated a comprehensive model of rational argumentative discourse about cognitive and normative validity claims. I will be I will give a very brief description of that to show then why what I have in mind differs from that. This model can certainly be considered the most consistent theory of rational argumentation that is currently available. The basic idea is that all rational discourse has its point of departure in speech acts in which a speaker pursues the goal to convince the listener that his or her implicit or explicit validity claims are justified. The listener is then expected not simply to listen, but to accept the validity claim or to give better reasons why he or she cannot or can only partially agree. In this case, the speaker is confronted with an alternative validity claim, which implies that he is now expected to accept the views of the partner on this matter, or again to give reasons why he cannot do so. The ensuing process is considered a process of the mutual modification of the original validity claims, so that if there are no time constraints or other external restrictions on the forces of argumentation, this discourse will reach an organic end state in which the participants will have reached an unenforced consensus. That's the basic idea, I would say, of Habermas's philosophy. Habermas and Apel are both well aware that this model is, of course, an idealization of empirical processes of argumentation, but they consider the idealization not a worthless abstraction, but a regulatory idea that guides us in our empirical world. All objections directed against the alleged naivete of this model are therefore, I think, misplaced. But this does not mean that it is the last word about discourse or about ethics, about questions of moral philosophy. In my writings, and if you are interested, I would like to point you to the last chapter of my book, The Genesis of Values. There I have presented, I would say, a long list of critical reservations with regard to this model, mostly concerning questions like, for example, the motivation to enter into such a discourse. I mean, why should we be willing to be part of such a discourse? Or the motivation to act in accordance with the results of such argumentation. We may agree that it is fair to do this, but then not care, so to speak, if it's against my interests. Or problems that concern the relationship between justification in such discourses and practical application, and so on and so on. I leave all this aside here. My exclusive focus in these remarks is on the question as to whether we can imagine having such a purely rational discourse about values. And if not, whether the only alternative is the nihilism of pure confrontation or decision. I assume that many of you share the intuition that there is a third way between a completely rational discourse in this Habermasian sense and the conflict of competing values or value systems. Just to give an example, think of interreligious dialogues. For example, the relatively successful dialogue between Christians and Jews in post-war Germany, or between Christians and Buddhists in contemporary Southeast Asia. Jürgen Habermas readily admits that in the case of values, no clear separation of questions of validity from questions of genesis is possible. And that values, therefore, cannot be submitted to the same argumentative procedure as cognitive and normative validity claims. But this does not lead him to specify what the logic of a communication about values would look like. For him, the main consequence from this insight is that values are inherently particular and do not allow for universalization in the same sense in which cognitive and normative propositions do. What is more, for Habermas, to be particular means to be particularist. That is, for him, and he says that very explicitly, there can be no such thing as a universalist value orientation, which means that all hope for universalization then lies in the spheres of law and morality in a normative sense. This, I think, is inappropriate, not only with regard to all post-axial religions, think of Christianity, but also with regard to the specific structures of our communication about values. So what are the differences between a rational discourse in the Habermasian sense and our communication about values? I see at least three such differences. First, when we talk about values, a strongly affectual dimension comes in. Although all values can be reformulated in propositional form as statements like "it is good to do X" or "it is evil to do Y," and although all religious and secular encompassing worldviews contain factual statements like "Jesus has risen from the dead" or "Muhammad is the prophet," our commitment to these is different from our commitment to purely cognitive validity claims. We have to take seriously the fact that we cannot simply have values as we may have opinions, but that we have to feel strongly committed to them if the word value commitment is to make any sense. William James, the great American pragmatist philosopher on whose thinking I rely in this respect and in some others, emphasized that we have to see the parallels between our commitment to values and our commitment to persons. For example, between religious faith and love. And this not so much in the sense of, let's say, a religion or an ethics of love in Christianity, but mostly in the sense that our commitment to particular values is similar to our commitment to particular persons in our life. When we are asked why we love a certain person, let's say why I love my wife, my son, my closest friends, we realize that it may be inappropriate to derive our feelings of love from a list of specific attributes, talents, or achievements of the beloved person. Even personal relations do, of course, have a cognitive side. They are based on certain assumptions about the character and behavior of the beloved person in the past, present, the future. In that sense, we can certainly make plausible where our commitment to that person comes from. But our expectations with regard to the listener are very different from rational discourse. It is neither our expectation nor our intention that those to whom we speak share our feelings and, in my example, instantly fall in love with my wife or with other same persons. Certainly not my intention. As compared to a discourse about norms, this goal of plausibility may look more modest than the goal of consensus. On the other hand, the fact that we cannot talk about values without referring to feelings and experiences makes a communication about values much richer than purely rational discourse about cognitive and normative validity claims. Second, the second difference to be mentioned here is a difference with regard to the negation of validity claims. It has often been recognized that the falsification of a cognitive proposition in a religious worldview, in most cases, does not weaken the commitment of believers to this faith. In their perspective, the factual statements of their faith can be rather flexible. Their basic feeling of certainty is neither grounded in quasi-empirical statements, let's say about the dating of the creation or something like that, nor is it shattered by their falsification. From a strictly empiricist standpoint, this, of course, makes believers look like narrow-minded dogmatists who are not willing to adjust their convictions to scientific progress and enlightened insight. But since the publication of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Reflections on Certainty in 1969 at the latest, it has become clear in the Anglo-Saxon philosophical tradition that all cognitive frameworks are based on certainties that are constitutive even for the procedures of falsification. These certainties themselves are not fallible in the same sense in which all individual propositions in the constituted framework are. When our basic values are affected, our reaction with regard to doubt or the person articulating this doubt will often not be the modification of our conviction, but a devaluation or derogation of that person. I quote from the late British philosopher Bernard Williams' magisterial book, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, a short passage that I like also because of its, let's say, British humor to make that point. Williams wrote, "One does not feel easy with the man who in the course of a discussion of how to deal with political or business rivals says, of course we could have them killed, but we should lay that aside right from the beginning. It is characteristic of morality that it tends to overlook the possibility that some concerns are best embodied in this way, in deliberative silence." So we don't say, oh, we are fortunate to have such a humanist chairperson. He did not propose to kill our rival. How could he even have the idea in his mind that killing the rival is a possible strategy? Some of you might think that the second difference between a communication about values and the rational argumentative discourse is only an implication of the first, insofar as our unwillingness to submit to falsification is a consequence of our affectual commitment to values. But I think the second difference has more to do with the constitutive role of evaluations for the basic structures even of our cognitive frameworks. Third, the third difference I would call the necessary narrativity of a communication about values. Hilary Putnam, in his book, 1981 book, Reason, Truth and History, claims, in the context of a thought experiment about the question as to whether we submit mere preferences to acts of moral judgment, that value judgments are not isolated judgments, but form groups or clusters, and that we find only those preferences morally indifferent which are not in a closer connection with other preferences that are for us morally relevant. I fully agree. But I would go a step further and extend this idea of groups or clusters of value judgments so that it includes the temporal dimension. We cannot make plausible and defend our value commitments without telling stories. I made that point already in the first lecture with regard to traumatization and experiences of violence. Stories about the experiences from which our commitments arose. Stories about other people's experiences, or about the consequences a violation of our values had in the past. Biographical, historical, and mythological narrations, in this sense, are not just a matter of illustration for didactic purposes, but a necessary part of our self-understanding and of our communication about values. The insight that in the case of the communication about values, a strict separation of genesis and validity is impossible, should not lead to an exaggerated understanding of their separability in the case of cognitive and normative validity claims, but instead inspire us to take seriously the connection between narration and argumentation in all attempts to justify values. So what we need is a structure of argumentation that is genealogical, as I said in the introduction on Tuesday, but not genealogical, but not destructive in the Nietzschean and Foucaultian sense. And you probably realize that I have you could say, the aesthetic problem, that I do not want to defend the inherent connection between narration and argumentation only, but I want to, let's say, to represent it also. So I argue why this is necessary, but also my whole argument is also in itself an attempt to combine narration and argumentation in a specific way. So this was the first part. Second, much shorter, namely, what are the alternatives to this fully rational discourse in the Habermasian sense? If my ideas about the specificities of our value commitments are convincing, one might now assume that they will intensify the fear of those who think that power struggle is the only alternative to rational discourse. If strong emotions, as I said, an unwillingness to draw radical conclusions from empirical falsification, and an entanglement with history and mythology are unavoidable in the case of values, doesn't that entail that values should be excluded from the public sphere, so that the public sphere can remain an arena of rational discourse? Does my whole line of argumentation not support a strictly liberal view, then, according to which all citizens with strong convictions have to leave their particular worldviews, about which no rational consensus is possible, behind them when they enter the public sphere? Now, I obviously cannot discuss all aspects of this fundamental question here, but I would like to mention that this fear, in my eyes, is an overgeneralization of certain important negative experiences, for example, in the history of European religious conflicts, and that it is based on a reification of the concept of values. Values and value systems are treated in this, let's say, liberal position as entities that exclude one another and can even get into conflict with one another. But from the strictly action-oriented perspective, that is my perspective, be it pragmatist or Weberian, it is only human beings, their organizations and institutions that can act, not values, value systems, or for example, civilizations. They can't act. There can be logical inconsistencies between cognitive propositions and between values, but the human beings who believe in them, feel committed to them, or act on their basis have to detect these inconsistencies and to cope with them. The strictly liberal position is a possibility for human beings to act together, a possibility that is based on a bracketing of value commitments. Whether liberal or not, we all constantly interact and cooperate with others without paying attention to our value-related differences. But there are several other possibilities for dealing with such differences. We can, for example, take elements from other cultural traditions and fit them into our original framework in creative ways. Traditions are not hermetically closed, self-referential frameworks. They have to be actively perpetuated, and this happens under specific circumstances and in risky ways. Since values, value systems, traditions are not entities, but articulations of experience, it can also happen that we share experiences without sharing values. Experiences are articulated in different, maybe opposite ways, and we can feel committed to people without sharing their values, or committed to shared values without really feeling committed to certain people with whom we share these values. In the public discussion in Europe about European values, for example, and I've published extensively on that, we can often find a conflation of all these dimensions, so that it looks as if states or continents have one unitary and homogeneous culture. And in addition to the bracketing of value commitments, to the creative incorporation of other components, and to the differentiation between experience and values, we can also enter into a process of what I call value generalization. That's now the third point. As I said in the introduction, this concept stems from a theory of social change, namely the one that was developed by the most influential American sociologist of the 1950s and 60s, Talcott Parsons. In reaction to the many criticisms of his work that had blamed him for being unable to deal with social change, he applied his theory of the four basic functions each social system has to fulfill to this area of social change. The four functions had been called adaptation to the environment, goal attainment, integration, and maintenance of the value patterns characteristic for a social pattern. In a dynamic perspective, this means that all social change has to have four dimensions as well, namely adaptive upgrading, that is something like technological progress, social differentiation, inclusion of more and more members of society in the status of full citizenship, something I mentioned yesterday, and lastly, value generalization. The fullest exposition, if you want to read something here, of Parsons' ideas on value generalization can be found in his essay Comparative Studies and Evolutionary Change, published in 1971. Parsons, in whose theory the concept of value was absolutely crucial, had for a long time treated institutional value patterns as a primary respect, indeed the most important single structural component of social systems. For him, and now I'm sorry for this difficult technical language of Parsons, for him such value systems, when I quote him, have considerable stability, transcending the shorter run change in the structure of particular societies, meaning time periods of up to several centuries. But now it had become more and more clear to him that social differentiation cannot progress without affecting the dimension of institutionalized values in very important ways. This led him to the following basic proposition, I quote, "The more differentiated the system, the higher the level of generality at which the value pattern must be couched, if it is to legitimate the more specified values of all of the differentiated parts of the social system." It is evident that the concrete example he had in mind is the differentiation of church and state, and the institutionalization of a moral community within a society, which both cuts across denominational lines in the more narrowly religious sense and those of ethnic culture. Cutting across here means, and this can be taken as a definition of this concept of value generalization, I quote, "The inclusion under a single legitimizing value pattern of components which are not only diverse and differentiated from each other, but many of which have, historically, claimed some sort of an absolutistic monopoly of moral legitimacy," end quote. Parsons was fully aware that value generalization has to be seen as a process, and he has interesting things to say about the stages and the character of this process. Values have to be specified to be relevant in concrete action situations. The more differentiated the society is, the more different these specifications will be. To bring these differentiated definitions of values together, a redefinition of what holds them together has to happen. This is the process of value generalization. That is, of course, very often fraught with conflict in concrete situations. Some groups will protest against any alteration of their concrete commitments and see this as a surrender of integrity to illegitimate interests. Parsons called this already the fundamentalist reaction. Others will be motivated to discredit the fundamentalists and to hinder or reverse differentiation in their plea for radical innovation. Parsons considered his ideas as a contribution to an empirical theory of social change. That if one looks carefully at the way he phrased his claim, one realizes that there is a certain ambiguity in his thinking at that point. In an autobiographical statement, he qualified his understanding of value generalization as the mode of change required to complete such a phase for the system if it is to have the prospect of future viability. So value generalization for him has been necessitated by the industrial, the democratic, and the educational revolutions. But what exactly does it mean to call a process required or necessary? It is one of the crucial weaknesses of functionalist thinking in the social sciences to deduce a process from a functional requirement. Why should it be that what is necessary does indeed happen? This is, of course, also the point where the later followers of Parsons changed the theory. Now, very briefly, back to Habermas for a moment. Habermas interprets Parsons in his magnum opus, the two-volume theory of communicative action. Realizes this problem one has with functionalist reasoning and radicalized it beyond a mere anti-functionalist statement to a critique of an understanding of modernization in which tensions between the different dimensions of social change have been excluded from the outset. Not only does value generalization not simply follow, as in Parsons, from functional differentiation, it could even be that there are systematic tensions between ongoing differentiation processes and such processes of value generalization. But Habermas's intention at this point is almost the opposite of mine, of what I am pursuing here. For Habermas, value generalization leads to an uncoupling of communicative action from all concrete, normatively binding behavioral patterns. Social integration for him is more and more achieved through rational discourse and no longer based on any religiously anchored agreement. This is what he called the linguistification of the sacred, one of the most radical versions of the secularization thesis we have. I'm, of course, speaking about Habermas 1981 here, and you probably all know that in the last years he has, to some extent, modified his position with regard to religion, but that's not part of my topic here. What Parsons had in mind ran completely counter to such an idea of replacing value commitments by rational argumentation. For him, the crux of the matter was that different value traditions can indeed produce a more general, mostly also more abstract understanding of their common features without losing their roots in the specific traditions and experiences to which actors feel affectually committed. In its current articulation, a value may be the result of a particular cultural tradition. Human rights, for example, are claimed by some to be a result of the Judeo-Christian tradition or of the Enlightenment, but this does not mean that other cultural and religious traditions cannot be reinterpreted, or rather cannot reinterpret themselves in view of this articulation of a value, so that their own potential to articulate the same value comes to light. Such a reinterpretation must not be an intellectualization. Disconnected from the affectual side of a tradition, it would remain ineffective. Value generalization, as one possible result of a communication about values, would then neither be a consensus about a universalistic principle, which everybody has to accept as valid, nor a mere decision to live in peaceful coexistence despite value disagreement. Again, the result of the communication about values can at once be more and less than the result of rational discourse, not a full consensus, but a dynamic mutual modification and stimulation toward renewal of one's own tradition. Now, I think I skip over a small part here, namely where I say, so Parsons had this, I think, interesting idea, but didn't really apply it to normative questions, took it only as an empirical question of social change. Who else has similar ideas? And there are, of course, other authors with similar ideas, but I will not mention most of them, maybe because he's so extremely famous. I mention only one of them and show what the difference between his thinking and this idea is, namely John Rawls. John Rawls and his theory of justice, and you know, and the later works, and his idea of an overlapping consensus. I'm pretty sure that most of you are familiar with that, an overlapping consensus in this situation of a plurality of so-called comprehensive doctrines. This idea is similar in some respects and aspects to the idea of value generalization, but I think the concept of value generalization is superior because it does not describe a static constellation of the coexistence of doctrines. Overlap is static. Yeah? But a dynamic process of their mutual modification. And it is not restricted to a communication about constitutional or political principles that leaves the deepest layers of these value systems or traditions unaffected. Okay, fourth part. At this point, I would like to demonstrate the fruitfulness of this concept in a specific application to a concrete case of a communication about values and a concrete case of such a mutual modification. The studies on the drafting of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, published by, among others, Mary Ann Glendon, Johannes Morsink, Susan Waltz, Mark Masauer, are cases in point. None of them uses the concept of value generalization. But what they describe is one of the most consequential processes of value generalization in modern history. Proponents of the most diverse value traditions came together, united, as I said in my first lecture, in their rejection of Nazism and fascism, and formulated a declaration that does not have one rationalist justification, but presents itself as the shared articulation of all the value traditions that had been part of the process. Just look at the main individual actors in the process of drafting this declaration. The committee chairman was Eleanor Roosevelt, widow of the recently deceased American president, experienced activist, but certainly more the organizational leader and diplomatic moderator of the group than its intellectual spiritus rector. For many years, the French legal scholar René Cassin was considered to be the main author of the declaration. He was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his achievements in this regard. He was the son of an Orthodox Jewish mother and a secular Republican, in the French sense, French Jewish father. He was active in the anti-Nazi resistance and close to General de Gaulle during the war. Two things are particularly remarkable with regard to Cassin's role. Although being a secular rationalist himself, he seems to have been very open to the non-reactionary wing of French Catholicism, and to have received, as he wrote, on a number of occasions, discreet personal encouragements from the papal nuncio in France at the time, Angelo Roncalli, the future Pope John the 23rd. So when John the 23rd sort of opened the official church doctrine to these ideas, he had already been involved in formulating it before. The other remarkable point is that before the end of the war, and despite the traditional French emphasis on human rights as an achievement of France, it is difficult to find any references to them in his writings, as is also true for other figures of the Resistance. Recent historiography agrees that Cassin's legal expertise was very important in the process, but that others seem to have been much more influential with regard to the precise formulations, much more than Cassin. The two most important authors of the declaration were Charles Malik and Chung. Malik was a Christian Arab, a Greek Orthodox philosopher from Lebanon, former student of Whitehead in the US and Heidegger in Germany, where he was attacked by young Nazis because of his Semitic appearance. Spokesman for the Arab peoples in the conflict about the partition of Palestine, deeply influenced by the neo-Catholic discourse of personalism and the dignitarian understanding of rights there and in continental Europe, rather than by the more individualistic tradition of Anglo-American lineage. The other main author is even more colorful, Chung, Chinese philosopher, playwright, diplomat, came from a Confucian background, had taken his doctorate at Columbia University in New York with John Dewey. As a member of the diplomatic service of pre-communist China, he had taken over the task of making the Japanese massacres in China, for example, the so-called rape of Nanking, known in the world. As ambassador to Turkey, he had given talks in which he compared Confucianism and Islam, or Chinese and Arab history. As ambassador to Chile, he had come into contact with the lively interwar human rights discourse in Latin America. His constant critique of the attempts to see either an Enlightenment understanding of reason or a specific religious tradition as the only legitimate foundation of human rights was crucial for the intellectual exchange that took place in the committee. Other important contributors seem to have been Hernán de la Cruz, a socialist from Chile who brought in the Latin American discourse just mentioned, and Hansa Mehta, a female Indian delegate who succeeded, among other things, in making the language of the declaration gender neutral. It's not all men are brothers, for example, what others had proposed. I do not want to offer an idealized picture here of the discussions in this committee. No doubt there were many, here I quote Mary Glendon, many disagreements, misunderstandings, personal quirks, national rivalries, and colonial resentments. But despite all these and serious external obstacles, the process of value generalization was in the end successful. Even what may look to us today as the hardest points, namely the attitude of Muslim representatives to conversion away from Islam and to the status of women in the family and outside of it, proved not to be insurmountable. With the exception of Saudi Arabia, all the participating states with large Muslim populations accepted the declaration. Only a detailed narrative could really do justice to these dynamics of the process of value generalization. But maybe the few elements of such an account mentioned here already make my claim plausible that we have here indeed a prototypical case of value generalization. The myth of a Western ideological construct imposed on the rest of the world cannot survive close historical scrutiny of the drafting process. Unfortunately, I cannot conclude, however, on this relatively optimistic note. It is true that successful processes of value generalization are possible. And it is also true that to some extent, at least, horrible crimes can galvanize support for an intense commitment to and reformulation of universalist values. But we cannot suppress the question as to which conditions made such a free-ranging discussion process possible. What gave these individuals the freedom to enter into such a process? What opened the window of opportunity for them and for this drafting process in general. The closer we look at the conditions for the process, the more disillusioned we become. We can neither speak of an uncontroversial reaction to Nazism, nor of a long and slow but clearly progressive process of increasing commitment to the human rights idea. In the interwar years, some international lawyers had already formulated such declarations and tried to pressure the League of Nations into adopting them, but almost no one took any notice. Something similar could be said with regard to the reception of the human rights discourse in anti-colonial circles or among blacks in South Africa and the US. What changed in the war years was, on the one hand, the fact that the Allied powers had, from Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech on, formulated their war aims in a way that used the human rights language. And on the other hand, a switch from the League of Nations regime of the protection of ethnic minorities to a regime of the protection of the rights of individuals. Two historical developments make these two changes look rather hideous in retrospect. Toward the end of the war, already before the capitulation of Germany, at least two of the great powers, namely Britain and the Soviet Union, attempted, as Mark Masauer wrote, to brush human rights under the carpet. It is due to the storm of criticism from mostly American non-governmental organizations, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, labor movement, peace movement, and to governments of so-called small states, that these attempts were not successful. And, even more hideous, part of the reason why some, like Eduard Beneš, the post-war president of Czechoslovakia, found a human rights declaration acceptable was that it allowed them the mass expulsion of the German and Hungarian minorities from Czechoslovakian territory, something a renewal of the minority rights policy would have made legally impossible. So, again, a quote from Masauer, behind the smoke screen of the rights of the individual, in other words, the corpse of the League's minority policy could be safely buried. Even the American government representatives involved in this process, who were probably a little bit less cynical than the Soviets and the British, made it very clear to Eleanor Roosevelt and others that they would not tolerate any serious interference into their national sovereignty. That is why a declaration was the way out. Without all implementation procedures, no courts, no convention, a declaration was thought to be unproblematical. Fortunately, the time after the declaration has shown that values and a declaration of generalized values can exert a considerable influence on intellectual discussions, on lived practices, and even on political and legal institutions. I have made an attempt in these 3 lectures to show the interplay of ideas and interests, as Max Weber would have said, in the history of human rights, without reducing one to the other. Ideas are not simply the expression of interests. I see the history of human rights as a complex interplay of changes in 3 dimensions: values, practices, and institutions. The crucial term, as you know, for this process for me is the sacralization of the person. Sacralization of the person is a process on the level of practices, often articulated in the communication about values, sometimes institutionalized in moral and legal regulations. Sacralization of the person can have religious and secular motivations and articulations. It can be driven by positive, enthusiastic, and by negative, traumatic experiences. Institutionalizations require a constellation in which actors with value rational or instrumental orientations end up translating the subjective certainty of value commitments into officially declared values or normative prescriptions. There is no logical reason why one of these three dimensions, values, practices, institutions, should always have chronological priority. But it is also clear that in the long run, human rights can only have a firm foundation in our world if they are supported on all three levels, by our official institutions and by non-governmental organizations, if they are argumentatively defended in intellectual debates about values, and if they are incarnated in the practices of everyday life. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again, and we have, as we had the last couple of nights, about a half an hour for discussion. We have a mic here in the center row. I'd ask you to approach the mic if you have a question, briefly introduce yourself, and keep the questions brief as well so we can have as much time for discussion as possible.
No questions?
Taking the long way around.
Okay. Ah, yes.
My name is Carl Sorensen. I live out in Falls Church area. Yesterday, you made a comment that brought something else to my mind. You mentioned in the context of punishment and of making people follow the values and the expectations of society, the outrage that people have when those norms are violated. And it made me remember something I read after the massacre in Virginia a couple years ago, where one of the people included the perpetrator in the list of victims and basically said the outrage wasn't placed against the person, it was against the situation that the person had a particular condition or a reason for that. I wonder if you had a comment about that process and kind of going along those lines. If we, I think there's a process underway where we're going away from moral outrage at what people are doing and looking more at practical reasons for why those things happen. And that kind of introduces the question of what we can do to influence people. I mean, we already do punishment, we already do education, mandatory education. At what point does it become a threat to people's rights to believe absurd things or to teach absurd things to their children and things like that?
Mm-hmm. This is a question that is more directed at yesterday's lecture, if I may say so, than at today's lecture. I'm willing to respond to it, but it's not, I mean, the substance was in yesterday's lecture. Okay, maybe three brief remarks. Yes, I do think, and at this point I follow Durkheim, as I said, that the best indicator for the value commitments people have is strong moral feelings when a value is violated, okay? And one part of what I said today about the affectual component in our value commitments supports this argument in yesterday's lecture. That is why I'm skeptical, for example, with regard to large parts of the research about values, if this is based on questionnaires. If you ask people, what are your values, so to speak, is justice important for you? So most people will say yes, very important for me. But you don't know much about these people when you have these answers. You know a lot when you see this outrage. Okay, that is point one. Point two is, that is the reason why crimes will never be treated unemotionally in a society, so to speak. As soon as we at least that type of crimes that has anything to do with the basic values of a society or of some people in that society. Now, the point I made yesterday was that if we think in terms of, let's say, sacralization of the person and increased sensitivity to cruelty, for example, we will be more and more outraged with regard to crimes that are cruel, for example. But at the same time, we are more and more restricted, so to speak, in the expression of these strong feelings with regard to the criminal. Because the same process of sensitization applies to the body of the criminal. I think we all know that in certain cases, let's say, people who kill children for their sexual satisfaction or something like that. I mean, most people I know have very strong feelings about that, so to speak. And if their own children, if they imagine their own children are affected, can easily imagine, or maybe I should just speak for myself, so to speak. I mean, to feel a certain temptation to kill such a person if that happens to you. You understand what I mean? But still, at the same time, so to speak, or for the same reason that this is such an important, enormous outrage for me, I realize also that if I look at the criminal himself, so to speak, he is a human being with a history and so on. He's not a monster. And although sometimes newspapers use this term, nobody seriously thinks today that some human beings are a monster. So that third and last point leads to the, let's say, the task of the rule of law to integrate this emotional dimension, but at the same time to channel it, to proceduralize it. The population has to have the strong conviction, I would say, that their feelings are justified, so to speak, that something happens to them, that they have no reason to think these people can get away easily with their crimes. So the channeling is the redirection of the strong feelings of outrage into feelings of trust into the law enforcement system. Okay, that's a kind of reconstruction of this argument. I don't know whether it helps. But as I said, it's not really about today's presentation.
Now that we have a rush for the microphone, let me get in here first. Just going back to your point on Parsons and differentiation. Yes. With modernity, we generally, at least out of a Parsons kind of theory, evolutionary theory, we see differentiation as critical, and especially in terms of values and religious traditions, how we develop a theology and sort of an irrational approach to be able to dialogue about our values with other groups. And yet we face today, it seems to me, in terms of a really profound value discussion across cultures, we're finding some cultures and religious traditions which really haven't gone through that kind of transition that we would define more as differentiation. How then do we have that kind of value dialogue? How do we pursue that value dialogue? Is differentiation really a premise, a sine qua non of the kind of value dialogue that we're capable of in the West? And I'm thinking especially in the Islamic dialogue, when we face the Islamic, the situation where the Christian, the Jewish, and the Islamic groups are getting together, are there experiences of modernity which actually hinder us from stepping back into perhaps deeper value commitments, kinds of value commitments that we can't articulate through a more rational framework, and therefore actually can't communicate about?
It's a huge question, of course. Let me try to answer it in the following way. I mean, differentiation is not a good thing in itself. I always find it important to say which differentiation, so to speak. What do we want to differentiate from what, to what extent? So one of the criticisms one could have of Parsons would be that he treats differentiation as if it is clear what is differentiated from what, and then even assumes that such a process of value generalization accompanies the process of functional differentiation more or less automatically, and I say it doesn't. Look at, for example, the differentiation, let's say, between religious communities and the state. For me, it is enormously instructive to see that there can be completely different national models for this same task of differentiation. That there are several European ways also, but if we take for a moment a kind of European model and compare it to an American model, I see a major difference here. And the major difference is that in Europe, the tendency certainly was to say separation of state and church. I mean, if we take France in whatever sense as a somewhat prototypical case for some parts of Europe, so to speak, that differentiation of state and church means something like a secular state that looks with skepticism at the religious communities, keeps them at a distance. And that is clearly not the US-American way for that. So I think, for example, I say it in a facetious manner, if at the beginning of the French Revolution, the Pope would have known more about the American way, he would not have had to react to the idea of human rights in such a negative way as he did. Do you understand what I mean? He identified the idea of human rights with the French Revolution, with the French attempts at the time to nationalize and then to persecute the Catholic Church. And so he saw that as something evil. He didn't even have the imagination to say, for example, a regime where you have a state with a kind of benevolent attitude to religion, but at the same time that demands from the church an inner acceptance of religious plurality would be a way out of this situation. And for this distinction now between these two different ways of differentiation, so to speak, the word differentiation as such is not completely helpful. It only describes a task, but it does not show us what the different solutions to this task are. Now, I would apply that to this discourse today, is Islam able, and so on. I see the history of Muslim societies as so much more diverse, so to speak. There were so many possibilities of arrangements between Muslims, or between state and religion. All these concepts get a little bit difficult here, but I use them as abbreviations here, that there is no real reason to say Islam as a religion as such prevents a fruitful coexistence of a relatively secularized state and some degrees of religious pluralism in these societies. So I would not construct the situation in that sense. This is an achievement of a Christian civilization. Unfortunately, other religions don't have this achievement, and so they do not really understand, and this is a problem for them. And I think that is not the correct, not that you gave this description, but you find this description in many publications. I think it's not the right way to describe the situation.
Hello, Sarah McNamer from the Department of English. I wanted to ask you about the limits of reverence for affectual commitment. It seems that your model...
For what?
The limits of affective commitment,
yes,
or affectual commitment. It seems that your model gives a great sort of a place for that. Yet, what are the limits of that? You seem to be showing ways or gesturing towards ways of integrating and channeling that affective commitment. But what are the limits? Because one can think of, say, anti-Semitism and hatred as an emotion that was generated in part through Christian medieval, for example. There's a way in which emotion is not something pure and always to be honored and valued at every moment. I wonder also about the internal structure of emotion, about theories that articulate a vision of emotion that is rational, that they are upheavals of thought, that they are logical, that they're rational at a certain level. Mm-hmm. But the main question is, where do we know? How do we know when to respect affect?
Right. Okay. What I said about the affectual dimension of value commitment, does not mean that I say all affects are good or all values are good. It's a descriptive statement that when we talk about value commitments, whatever the values of a person are, we talk about something that is also of great emotional importance for this person. So true for me, true for all the others, so to speak, and we may disagree about everything, okay? So I'm not saying, so to speak, only the good people or only the bad people have strong emotions or anything like that. Everybody, as soon as he or she has a strong value commitment, has something that is truly emotionally important for this person. Now, when we enter into dialogue or into debates or something like that, I said explicitly, we can, of course, and we often have to, for example, we do right now, to a large extent, abstract from this emotional involvement we have. I can make statements of a purely rational character. For example, as I said, it is good to do X. And ask you, can you agree with that? And you then may say yes or no. Then I ask you for reasons, not for emotions. I ask you for, why don't you agree with that, and so on. And I personally think that it depends on the concrete partners to such an interaction, so to speak, whether they can carve out a sphere where they agree, whatever their biographical backgrounds are, or not. So the interesting point is when they realize that after serious and honest engagement with each other, that they cannot agree about something fundamental. At that point, what I'm saying is we don't have to leave that there, that we say, okay, so we disagree, there is no way to come to any understanding about that. But it helps to introduce a narrative dimension into the dialogue. I mean, for example, it may be that I may ask you, of course you would have to accept that, I may ask you, tell me, I can't understand why you are so dogmatic with regard to this aspect. I have the impression I've given you now so many good reasons to change your mind, but you clearly do not change your mind. Why is this so important for you? And then you may tell me, for example, yeah, I tell you something. In my childhood, one of my crucial experiences was this or that. And then I said, this may at least lead to a feeling of plausibility, for example. I might say, okay, we still disagree, but now I understand better why this point is so important for you. And the next move in such a communication, which I think is no longer this Habermasian discourse, but this partly narrative argumentation, I may say, okay, I am willing to take very seriously the experiences you have just described. But couldn't you maybe think about the following alternative interpretation of this experience? You know, I give you an example from my own background, okay? My grandfather on the paternal side was deeply, deeply believing Catholic. My father was not, he was a Nazi. Why? Partly because the family in which he grew up, they lost all the money they had saved in this big inflation of 1923, okay? And because they ascribed this inflation, you can say that's ridiculous, but they ascribed it to Jewish bankers and so on, or not the parents, the son, and the whole generation, or large part of this generation, attributed it to some machinations of Jewish bankers. So they became anti-Semitic. Now what I'm saying, for example, is it doesn't make sense when somebody comes up and says, I'm a Nazi, so to speak, to say, okay, so we disagree, let's not talk to each other, and so on. Of course, in a concrete political conflict, that may be, I may vote for prohibiting the Nazi party or something like that. But in a concrete interpersonal exchange, it may be that you would have to listen, so to speak, which experiences led this person to defend such a crazy worldview. And you have to take the experiential basis, even of the craziest worldview, seriously, I think, because you have to take the experiences of all human beings seriously, not exclude anybody, so to speak, from at least from your imagination. You know, you understand what I don't know whether I make myself clear, but in such a situation, yeah, at least you learn something. You know, it can be empirically completely misguided to assume that, let's say, a dogmatic Nazi will be willing to change his mind because you talk to him. That's not my point. But your own attitude to, let's say, the generation of Nazis or of East German neo-Nazis today, for example, changes completely if you think about them in such an attitude that they also have some experiences, they have their own interpretations of that, they draw the wrong conclusions from that, and so on. But it's no longer a mere clash of values or clash of doctrines, so to speak, but it includes empathy even with the enemy or so, yeah? And it enriches your own understanding of the world and of the reason how this moved. So that is how I would construct that. Mm-hmm.
Probably started to answer my question. I want to invite you to say more about your model, actually. So is the model, we have a little bit of reason, little bit of force, or little bit of rationality, but you seems to do something that it's not only the combination of the two, there is a third medium. And I'm trying to think of things that the category of the aesthetical in the rich sense of reflective judgment, rather determined judgment that move from the particular to the universal. It has a hope that it would reach agreement, but it doesn't impose agreement. And the whole category, for example, in Edmund Burke starts manners, or which is, it's something which reaches out, but it has only a hope to reach agreement. So how would you situate, or for example, Hannah Arendt, the idea of sensus communis to your paradigm?
Okay, I think I said during the talk here, I'm skipping over all the authors that one could mention who could be seen as somehow contributing to such an idea of, what I call reasonable communication about values. You know, it's a terminological problem. I say reasonable, not rational, because I leave the term rational, so to speak, to the theory of rational argumentation in Habermas. But I want to say it's not just conversation either, so to speak. Yeah? But there are some standards of what is the word, reasonability or something like that, for that also. Yeah? Now I would say, you're alluding to that in Kant's critique of judgment, that has then been taken up by Hannah Arendt in a creative way. I personally think, and I'm more influenced by that, for example, in John Dewey's writings about practical judgments and so on, in Ernst Troeltsch's work about the dialogue between different religious traditions, and so we have many starting points for that. So I think there are many possible reference authors for an attempt to say, and I liked your introductory statement, it's not true that we have an opposition between complete rational argumentation and mere force. But the most interesting area may be, at least as soon as values are concerned, or where values are concerned, is this middle ground. And I would like to add, you know, to make things easier for me, I restrict the claim of this model to values and leave, so to speak, the other two main questions in the Habermasian language, cognitive and normative validity claims, to Habermas. But that's not what I really think. It's just to make it easier to develop that in connection with values. I don't really think that is possible, because even, for example, for cognitive validity claims, certain evaluative propositions are fundamental. As soon as you move from judging individual cognitive statements to thinking about whole cognitive frameworks, the evaluative dimension comes in, as we have all learned probably from Thomas Kuhn and so on, that there is no necessary consequence from the falsification of individual cognitive claims to the falsification of the wider, more comprehensive cognitive frameworks. There is much space in the wider frameworks to adapt to the falsification of cognitive frameworks. So the ambition, so to speak, goes even beyond the mere realm of values, namely to the evaluative dimension, even in the cognitive and normative validity claims. And this brings it even closer to what you just mentioned.
Maybe I'll take the prerogative of the chair. Please stand by the mic, but I do want to ask a question. Would it be safe to say, Hans, that you have a very optimistic approach to the possibility of value generalization, the possibility of finding common ground across cultural and religious lines? You just gave the one historical example. Yes. But in today's world, if we push forward 40, 50, 60 years from that example, what resources one would have to convince, say, a communist, a Marxist-Leninist on the one hand, or a religious extremist on the other, of the validity of such a conversation in the first place, and in the second place, of possibility for some common ground?
Am I optimistic? Okay, first level, I would say, as a character, yes. Second, politically, I don't think so. And I mean, the way you put it was interesting, because you said you are optimistic with regard to the possibility. And that's true. I said, for example, I see the successful process of writing the United Nations Declaration in 1948 as a case that proves that a process of value generalization, or you might say a process of dialogue between different religious traditions and secular traditions, can be successful. Yes, I'm optimistic with regard to the possibility, but am I optimistic with regard to, let's say, the realization of that possibility? That's a different question. And that's why I added, after this description of the drafting process, a rather, I would say, pessimistic analysis of the conditions that made this drafting process possible. It was a short moment in history. There was enormous opportunism on the side of the Soviets, for example. I mean, they had nothing to do with the human rights idea. They thought it is a clever move not to say yes, but to abstain. The British, they became nervous as soon as they had the impression that any item on this list of human rights could influence their colonial rule. But if it doesn't, and if it's merely a declaration, doesn't do much harm, why annoy the Americans if they want that? Even on the American side, you know, these people seem to have been very surprised when Du Bois took the initiative and sent in a petition to the Commission in 1947 saying what you are discussing here must have grave consequences for race segregation in the South. So please bear that in mind. The American delegation, so to speak, was very surprised to hear that they might be the object of criticism in this connection. So I personally think, for example, when this was put on paper, most relevant actors thought we can put it on paper because it is irrelevant. And then something interesting set in, but we cannot explain what set in out of the fact that this happened in 1948. So in general, I would say my formula would be, I mean, I think there are several people are mentioned as the author of this formula, optimism of the will, pessimism of your reason, or something like that. Namely, believe in the possibility, but see without any delusion the enormous obstacles Now, with regard to the religious situation in the world today, I mean, what on everybody's mind is the situation with regard to Islam. Yeah? Nobody, I think, that's mostly that. It might be Hindu nationalism or Protestant fundamentalism in the US or so, but mostly what people mean when they speak about this concretely today is Islam.